I was 27 when I signed the lease for that cramped apartment above Marcelli's, an old Italian restaurant that had been shuttered for 3 years. The landlord, a sweaty man named Frank who wore the same stained polo shirt to every meeting, assured me the building was solid. "Just need some character," he said, jangling his keys. "Historic charm, you know?" What he really meant was that the place reeked of rancid cooking oil, the floorboards sagged like a trampoline, and every surface was held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. But when you're bartending at a dive bar and scraping together tips just to afford ramen, you don't argue with $450 a month. The apartment was a shoebox with a kitchenette, a bedroom barely big enough for a twin mattress, and a living area that doubled as my dining room, office, and storage unit. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television through the drywall, and the windows rattled every time a semi-truck hit the potholes on Meridian Street. My routine was simple and predictable. I'd finish my shifts at the bar around 2 in the morning, grab whatever leftover food the kitchen was throwing out, and trudge up the narrow staircase that connected my apartment to the alley behind the building. Most nights, I'd kick off my work boots, crack open a cheap beer, and put on some mindless television until exhaustion finally dragged me to sleep. The freight trains that rolled through downtown would shake the entire building, and delivery trucks would rattle my windows when they rumbled past. But after a few weeks, I got used to the noise. That's why I didn't think much of it when I first heard the scraping sounds coming from beneath my feet. It started about a month after I moved in, always around the same time each night, just as I was settling in with my post-work beer and whatever reheated pizza or burger I'd managed to score from the kitchen. The sound was subtle at first, like fingernails dragging across wood, or maybe rats gnawing at something in the walls. Old buildings attract vermin, especially ones that used to house restaurants. I figured it was just part of the charm Frank had promised me. But the scraping became more regular, more deliberate. It would start with a soft scratching sound, then progress to what sounded like something being dragged across the underside of my floorboards. Sometimes I could swear I heard the faint click of a lighter, followed by the distant smell of cigarette smoke that I initially attributed to my own chain-smoking habit. The sounds would last for maybe 20 or 30 minutes, then stop abruptly, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. One particularly exhausting night after dealing with drunk college kids and their complicated cocktail orders, I collapsed onto my secondhand couch with a plate of cold fries and tried to zone out to some late-night comedy show. That's when I heard it again, directly beneath where I was sitting. The scraping was louder this time, more aggressive, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. Without thinking, I stomped my heel against the floor, hoping to scare off whatever rodent had taken up residence in my building's infrastructure. The sound stopped immediately, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with a creeping dread that I couldn't quite explain. When I got up to grab ketchup from the kitchen, I noticed that one of the floorboards near my refrigerator was slightly elevated, as if someone had pried it up and hastily replaced it. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the edge, feeling fresh scrape marks in the wood and a fine layer of sawdust that definitely hadn't been there when I moved in. That discovery kept me awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, jumping at every sound from the street below. The next day at work, I mentioned it to my coworker Danny, trying to play it off as a funny story about my sketchy living situation. "Guess I've got some new roommates," I joked, but even as I said it, something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The scraping continued every night for the next week, always in the same location, always with that same deliberate rhythm that suggested intelligence rather than random animal activity. I started paying closer attention to the sounds, trying to map out what might be happening beneath my floor. There was definitely movement down there, and occasionally I could swear I heard what sounded like someone opening and closing containers or maybe unwrapping food. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I waited until I had a day off, then armed myself with a crowbar I'd bought at the hardware store and carefully pried up that loose floorboard. What I found underneath made my stomach drop. The space between my floor and the restaurant ceiling below was cramped but navigable, and someone had clearly been using it as a living space. There were cigarette butts scattered across the joists, still yellow with fresh tar. Cracker crumbs and candy wrappers were pushed into corners. A dirty blanket was wadded up against one of the support beams. But the most disturbing discovery was the hole that had been carefully cut through the restaurant ceiling below. Through it, I could see into Marcelli's abandoned kitchen, and there was a faint glow coming from somewhere inside the supposedly empty building. My hands were trembling as I replaced the floorboard and shoved my refrigerator on top of it. I sat there for 20 minutes with my phone in my hand, trying to decide who to call and what to tell them. How do you explain to someone that there's a person living in the crawl space under your apartment, accessing an abandoned restaurant that's supposed to be locked and secured? When I finally worked up the nerve to call my landlord, Frank laughed it off. Probably just rats, kid. These old buildings, you get all kinds of critters. Maybe some lights are flickering because of bad wiring. You know how it is. His dismissive tone made it clear he wasn't going to do anything about it, and I didn't have the energy to argue with him. But I knew what I'd seen, and over the next few days, I started noticing other things that confirmed my worst suspicions. Items in my apartment were being moved around. Nothing valuable was stolen, but small things would appear in different places than where I'd left them. A fork that I'd put in the dish rack would show up in a kitchen drawer. My lighter would migrate from the coffee table to the windowsill. My spare set of keys disappeared entirely, only to reappear 2 days later in a place I was certain I'd already searched. The realization that someone had been entering my apartment while I was at work was almost worse than knowing they were living beneath my floor. I started taking pictures of how I left things before going to work and comparing them to how they looked when I came home. The differences were subtle but consistent. Someone was definitely coming and going from my space, treating it like their own personal convenience store. I decided I needed evidence that would convince the police to take me seriously. I bought a cheap motion-activated camera online and set it up to monitor the gap near my refrigerator where I'd found the loose floorboard. The first 2 nights yielded nothing but grainy footage of my empty apartment and shadows moving across the walls when cars passed by outside. On the 3rd night, the camera finally captured something useful. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. when the motion sensor was triggered. In the dim footage, I could see a section of my floor being carefully lifted from below. A hand emerged, followed by an arm, and then the head and shoulders of a person pulling themselves up into my apartment. The figure was thin and wiry, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, and moved with the practiced stealth of someone who had done this many times before. I watched in horror as the intruder crept through my kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers with the casual familiarity of someone who knew exactly where everything was kept. They took a can of soup from my pantry, grabbed a clean spoon from my drawer, and even helped themselves to a beer from my refrigerator before disappearing back through the hole in my floor. The footage was clear enough to see that this wasn't some desperate homeless person looking for a temporary shelter. This was someone who had turned my apartment into their personal supply depot, treating my belongings like they belonged in some twisted communal living arrangement. The methodical way they moved through my space suggested they'd been doing this for weeks, maybe months. I called the police immediately, but when they arrived, the intruder was long gone. The officers examined the hole in my floor and the camera footage, taking notes and photos, but their response was frustratingly bureaucratic. "Looks like breaking and entering," one of them said. "Could be a homeless individual who found access to the building. We'll file a report and increase patrols in the area, but without catching them in the act, there's not much more we can do." I showed them the evidence I'd collected, the disturbed belongings, the fresh scrape marks, the makeshift living space in the crawl space. They documented everything professionally, but I could tell they saw it as just another petty crime in a city full of bigger problems. "You might want to consider moving," one officer suggested. "Sometimes that's easier than trying to secure a building with this many access points." That night, I packed a bag and stayed at my friend's couch. I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping in my apartment knowing that someone could emerge from my floor at any moment. The next day, I went back to collect more of my belongings and found that the intruder had been there again. This time, they'd left a note on my kitchen counter, written in pencil on a piece of cardboard torn from a cereal box. "Thanks for the beer. You're a good roommate." The casual, almost friendly tone of the message was somehow more terrifying than any threat would have been. This person didn't see themselves as an intruder or a criminal. In their mind, we were sharing the space, and my belongings were communal property. The complete lack of boundaries or recognition of my privacy rights suggested a level of mental instability that made me genuinely fear for my safety. I started sleeping at friends' places and only returning to my apartment during daylight hours to collect my things. Each time I went back, there were new signs of the intruder's presence. Food missing from my refrigerator, dishes used and poorly washed, even my bed sheets rumbled as if someone had been lying on my mattress. The violation of my personal space was absolute and relentless. Frank finally agreed to let me break my lease early when I threatened to call the city inspector about the building's security issues. I didn't even try to collect my security deposit. I just wanted out. On my last day, as I was loading the final boxes into my car, I saw a thin man in a dark hoodie watching me from across the street. He was exactly what I'd expected based on the camera footage, pale, unkempt, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been living rough for a long time. When our Story 2. The Model Train Collector. I was grinding through my second year of nursing school in Buffalo when I found the apartment on Elmwood Avenue. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just another aging Victorian house that had been chopped up into rental units to squeeze maximum profit from minimum space. My apartment was on the second floor, accessible through a side entrance that led to a narrow staircase covered in industrial carpeting that had probably been installed sometime in the Reagan administration. The place was small but functional, one bedroom, a combination living room and kitchen area, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had been painted over so many times that the original porcelain was barely visible beneath layers of thick white enamel. The windows were drafty, the radiator made noise like a freight train, and every door in the place creaked on its hinges. But it was cheap and close to campus, which were the only two criteria that mattered when you're living on student loans and the occasional weekend shift at a local diner. My routine was exhaustingly predictable. Classes during the day, studying until my eyes burned, then more studying until I finally collapsed into bed sometime after midnight. Nursing school doesn't leave much room for a social life, especially when you're trying to maintain the grades necessary to keep your financial aid. Most nights, I'd grab an energy drink from my mini fridge, spread my textbooks across the kitchen table, and highlight notes until the words started blurring together on the page. The apartment's quirks became part of my normal routine. The radiator would hiss and clank when the heat kicked on, sounding like medieval torture devices warming up for the night shift. The windows rattled whenever the wind picked up, and the floorboards creaked with every step, announcing my movements to anyone who might be listening. But when you're exhausted enough, you learn to sleep through almost anything, and after a few weeks, I barely noticed the building's various symphonies of age and neglect. That's why the attic fan caught my attention so immediately when it first started running. It was just after 3 in the morning, and I was hunched over my pharmacology textbook trying to memorize drug interactions and side effects that would probably save someone's life someday if I could just force them to stick in my sleep-deprived brain. The fan was one of those old-fashioned exhaust units, the kind that gets mounted in the roof to pull hot air out of attic spaces during the summer months. The sound it made was unmistakable, a low mechanical groaning as the motor struggled to life, followed by the rhythmic whoosh of blades cutting through stagnant air. But here's the thing that made no sense. It was October in Buffalo, hardly the season when anyone would need attic ventilation. And more importantly, the switch that controlled the fan was located on the wall in my bedroom, behind a door that I always kept locked when I was studying in the kitchen. I sat there listening to the fan run for maybe 15 minutes, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Old houses have weird electrical systems, maybe the wiring was crossed somewhere, or maybe the switch was connected to something else entirely. But when I finally worked up the nerve to check my bedroom, the switch was still in the off position, exactly where I'd left it when I'd moved in months earlier. The fan kept running for another 10 minutes, then wound down and clicked off, leaving me sitting in the sudden silence and wondering if I was losing my mind from too much studying and too little sleep. I flipped the bedroom switch up and down a few times, but nothing happened. Whatever was controlling that fan, it wasn't the switch that was supposed to operate it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, listening for sounds from above. The attic space wasn't really meant for human occupation. It was just a narrow crawl space between my ceiling and the roof, barely tall enough for someone to crouch in. The access hatch was located in the hallway ceiling, secured with a pull cord that I'd never bothered to investigate because I had no reason to go up there. The fan incident repeated itself the next night and the night after that, always around the same time, always lasting for roughly the same duration. But on the fourth night, I started hearing additional sounds layered underneath the mechanical groaning of the fan motor. There was a soft clicking noise, rhythmic and deliberate, like the sound of wheels rolling over track joints. It reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite place what it was until my downstairs neighbor mentioned it a few days later. Martin was probably in his 60s, a retired factory worker who spent most of his time watching television with the volume turned up loud enough that I could follow along with his programs through my floor. He was watering the scraggly bushes in front of the building when I was taking out my trash, and he looked up at me with a curious expression. "Hey, your roommate still running those model trains up there?" he asked, gesturing toward my apartment with his watering can. I stopped dead in my tracks. What roommate? Martin looked embarrassed, like he'd said something wrong. "You know, the little electric trains. I hear them sometimes at night. That clickety-clack sound like they're running on tracks. Figured you or your roommate was into that hobby." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I didn't have a roommate, and I certainly didn't own any model trains. But Martin's description perfectly matched the clicking sounds I'd been hearing layered underneath the fan noise. Someone was up there in my attic space, and they were running model trains in the middle of the night. That revelation kept me awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. The rational part of my brain kept insisting there had to be another explanation. Maybe the building's previous tenants had left something behind in the attic. Maybe there was some kind of mechanical system up there that I didn't understand. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that someone was living above my head. I started paying closer attention to the timing and duration of the sounds. The fan would kick on first, probably to provide ventilation and mask other noises. Then came the clicking of what were unmistakably model train wheels on miniature tracks, sometimes running in continuous loops, sometimes stopping as if someone was operating them manually. Occasionally, I could hear what sounded like small objects being moved around, and once or twice, I caught the faint smell of food being heated, probably on some kind of portable camping stove. The psychological pressure of knowing someone might be living directly above me was exhausting. I couldn't concentrate on my studies, couldn't relax in my own apartment, couldn't sleep without wondering if someone was watching me through cracks in the ceiling. Every normal house sound became potentially sinister. Every creak of the building settling became evidence of someone moving around in spaces where they shouldn't be. I called my landlord on a Thursday morning, trying to sound calm and rational while explaining my concerns. "I think there might be someone accessing the attic space above my apartment," I said. "I've been hearing sounds that suggest someone might be living up there." His response was predictably dismissive. "That's impossible," he said. "The attic access is sealed, and I've got the only key. You're probably hearing squirrels or maybe pipes expanding and contracting. These old houses make all kinds of noises." But I knew the difference between random house sounds and the deliberate activities I was hearing above my ceiling. The model train clicking was too rhythmic, too consistent to be anything natural. Someone was definitely up there, and they had somehow found a way to access the attic space without using the official entry point in my hallway. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a small step ladder and positioned it under the access hatch, then stacked my heaviest textbooks on top of it as a makeshift barrier. It was a stupid gesture, more psychological comfort than actual security, but it made me feel like I had some control over the situation. The sounds continued for 3 more nights, seemingly unaffected by my textbook barricade. On the 4th night, I finally worked up the courage to confront whatever was happening above me. I waited until I heard the familiar startup sequence of the fan motor, then positioned myself directly under the access hatch and shouted, "I know you're up there. I'm calling the police." The sound stopped immediately. The fan wound down and clicked off, and for the first time in weeks, my apartment was completely silent. I stood there in my pajamas, heart pounding, listening for any indication of movement. Nothing, just the normal nighttime sounds of an old house settling into stillness. But the next morning, when I moved my stepladder to check the access hatch, I found that the textbooks I'd stacked as a barricade had been carefully moved and restacked in a neat pile on my kitchen table. Someone had gotten past my improvised security system without making a sound, rearranged my belongings, and returned to their hiding place without waking me up. That's when I called the police. The officers who responded were professional but skeptical, clearly dealing with what they saw as another paranoid tenant complaint. But when I explained about the sounds, the moved textbooks, and my landlord's refusal to investigate, they agreed to take a look in the attic space. What they found up there made me physically ill. Someone had indeed been living in the cramped space between my ceiling and the roof, and they turned it into a remarkably organized living area. There was a thin mattress rolled up against the joists, several blankets, a small camping stove with fuel canisters, and boxes of non-perishable food. But the most disturbing discovery was an elaborate model train layout that took up nearly a quarter of the available space. The train set was clearly expensive and meticulously maintained. There were multiple locomotives, dozens of cars, tiny buildings, and even miniature people positioned throughout the landscape. The tracks formed a complex network that allowed the trains to run in various patterns. It was the kind of hobby setup that represented years of collecting and thousands of dollars in investment. But what made it truly horrifying was the context. Someone had been living in my attic for months, possibly longer, running their model trains in the middle of the night while I tried to sleep below. They had found some alternative way to access the space, probably through a roof panel or an exterior entrance that bypassed the sealed hatch in my hallway. They had been eating, sleeping, and pursuing their hobby literally inches above my head. Story 3. The Digital Intruder. I've always been a night owl, and my work as a freelance cybersecurity consultant means I spend most of my productive hours when the rest of Phoenix is asleep. The desert heat makes daytime work unbearable anyway, so I've structured my life around the cooler, quieter hours between midnight and dawn. My home office doubles as a testing ground for the smart home security systems I review and recommend to clients, so I'm surrounded by the latest in digital protection technology, ironically making me feel more secure than most people have any right to be. My house is a modest ranch-style place in a subdivision that was built in the early 2000s, back when smart home meant having a programmable thermostat and maybe a garage door opener with a remote control. But I've retrofitted it with every piece of connected security technology available: smart locks, motion sensors, doorbell cameras, window alarms, and even smart smoke detectors that can differentiate between burnt toast and actual fires. If someone so much as steps on my front porch, I get an alert on my phone with a timestamp and a photo. My professional paranoia extends to my digital habits as well. I use VPNs, encrypted messaging, secure email services, and regularly audit my network for unauthorized access attempts. I've written articles about the vulnerabilities in popular home automation systems, and I know exactly how most security breaches happen, which is why the notification I received on a Tuesday night in November caught me so completely off guard. I was deep in the middle of drafting a report about wireless router vulnerabilities when my phone buzzed with an alert from my smart lock system. The message was straightforward and terrifying. Your lock has been reset to factory settings. The timestamp showed that the reset had occurred just seconds before the notification was sent, which meant whatever had triggered it was happening in real time. My first instinct was to assume it was a system glitch. Smart home devices are notorious for sending false alarms, especially older units that haven't been updated with the latest firmware patches. But when I pulled up the device logs to investigate, what I found made my blood run cold. There had been multiple login attempts on my lock system over the past several minutes, all originating from an IP address that geolocation services placed approximately 300 feet from my house. 300 feet! That wasn't some random hacker in another country trying brute force attacks on thousands of devices simultaneously. That was someone sitting in a car on my street, specifically targeting my security system with knowledge of my network configuration and possibly my personal information. The proximity was too precise to be coincidental, and the timing suggested they had been watching my house and waiting for an opportunity to attempt access. I immediately went to my front door and checked the physical deadbolt, even though my phone was telling me the electronic components had been compromised. My hands were shaking as I turned the metal mechanism, half expecting to find it unlocked or tampered with. But everything seemed normal from the mechanical perspective, which only made the digital intrusion more unsettling. The next hour was spent on the phone with my security system's technical support, trying to understand how someone could attempt to reset my lock from such close proximity. The support technician, a woman named Sarah, who sounded like she'd handled this type of call before, walked me through the logs and confirmed what I'd already suspected. "Someone is definitely trying to gain unauthorized access to your system," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "The fact that they're doing it from such close physical proximity suggests this isn't a random attack. They're targeting you specifically, and they have enough technical knowledge to attempt a factory reset, which requires access to specific device protocols." While I was on the phone with Sarah, my system registered another intrusion attempt. This time I could feel it physically as well as digitally. There was a faint vibration in my front door, so subtle that I initially thought I was imagining it. But as I pressed my ear against the wood, I could hear something that made my stomach drop. The soft sound of someone testing the door handle from the outside. The vibration wasn't random, it was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone gently turning the handle back and forth, testing the resistance and trying to gauge whether the electronic lock might be vulnerable to physical manipulation as well as digital attack. Whoever was out there wasn't just trying to hack my security system, they were conducting a comprehensive assessment of my home's vulnerabilities. I ended the call with technical support and immediately dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I described what was happening. The dispatcher was professional and reassuring, telling me that officers were being dispatched and advising me to stay inside and away from windows until they arrived. But as I waited for help to arrive, the digital attacks continued, and I could monitor them in real time through my security system's interface. The intruder was systematically probing different aspects of my network, trying to find weaknesses in my router configuration, attempting to access my doorbell camera feed, and even making attempts to override my motion sensor settings. It was like watching a professional burglar case my house, except they were doing it through digital channels while simultaneously conducting physical reconnaissance from my front porch. The police arrived about 15 minutes later, their flashlights sweeping across my yard and the street beyond. By the time they got there, the digital attacks had stopped, and there was no sign of anyone lurking around my property. The officers were thorough in their investigation, checking for footprints, examining my door and windows for signs of tampering, and taking notes about the electronic intrusion attempts I documented. But their response was frustratingly limited. "Looks like you've got someone with technical skills who's interested in your house specifically," one of the officers said. "The good news is they didn't actually gain access. The bad news is that without catching them in the act, there's not much we can do except file a report and increase patrol frequency in your neighborhood." I showed them the screenshots I'd taken of the intrusion attempts, the IP address logs, and the timeline of events. They documented everything professionally, but I could tell they were more comfortable dealing with traditional breaking and entering cases than cybersecurity incidents that exist in the gray area between digital and physical crimes. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my property looking for evidence of the previous night's visitor. In the soft dirt of the flower bed beneath my living room window, I found a clear set of boot prints. They were large, probably size 11 or 12, with a distinctive tread pattern that had left crisp impressions in the soil. More disturbing was their location. Whoever had left them had been standing directly beneath my window, in a position where they could potentially see into my house and observe my nighttime routines. I took photographs of the prints and called the police again, but the response was even more limited than the night before. "Could be anyone," the officer said. "Delivery person, neighbor kid, someone cutting through your yard. Without additional evidence connecting those prints to the digital intrusion, we can't really do much with them." But I knew better. The timing was too coincidental, and the positioning of the prints was too deliberate. Someone had been watching my house, studying my habits, and planning some kind of intrusion that combined physical surveillance with sophisticated digital attacks. The fact that they had been close enough to attempt real-time hacking of my security system while simultaneously conducting physical reconnaissance suggested a level of planning and technical knowledge that was genuinely frightening. Over the next several weeks, I became hyper-vigilant about digital security alerts and physical signs of surveillance. I changed all my passwords, updated every piece of firmware in my smart home system, and even hired a professional security consultant to audit my network configuration for vulnerabilities. But the psychological damage was already done. Every notification from my security system made my heart race, and every unexpected sound from outside had me checking my door locks and peering through my curtains. The indirect harassment continued in subtle ways. My security cameras would occasionally capture footage of the same vehicle passing by my house multiple times in a single evening, always slowly, as if the driver was studying my property. I'd receive brief interruptions in my internet service that lasted just enough to disrupt my security system monitoring. Small things would be moved around in my yard, nothing stolen or damaged, but clear evidence that someone was entering my property when I wasn't home. The worst incident happened about a month after the initial intrusion attempt. I was working late in my office when I received an alert that my smart doorbell had detected motion on my front porch. When I pulled up the live video feed, I could see a figure standing just outside the camera's range, close enough to trigger the motion sensor, but positioned carefully to avoid being clearly recorded. For nearly 20 minutes, this person stood just beyond the edge of my doorbell camera's field of view, occasionally moving slightly to trigger additional motion alerts, but never stepping into a position where I could get a clear image of their face or identifying features. It was psychological warfare, designed to let me know I was being watched while avoiding providing evidence that could be used for identification or prosecution. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the person had vanished. The officers found fresh footprints in my flower bed, but they were positioned in the same location as before, and without additional evidence, there wasn't much they could do except file another report and promise to increase patrols in my area. The harassment campaign continued sporadically for several more months, always subtle enough to avoid crossing clear legal lines, but persistent enough to make me constantly anxious about my safety and privacy. I installed additional security cameras, upgraded my network security, and even considered moving to a different house, but I was reluctant to let someone drive me from my home through intimidation tactics. Eventually, the incidents stopped as abruptly as they had started. I never found out who was responsible or what their ultimate goal might have been, but the experience left me with a profound understanding of how vulnerable we all are in our digitally connected homes, and how easily someone with technical knowledge and malicious intent can blur the lines between cybercrime